Okay. Uh, Hello, everyone. I know this isn't the traditional way that we would record our lectures, but obviously, with the classroom being locked, I can't get in there to use the projector as I would like to. So this is how we're going to be doing things. And I'm going to take these off because it's just the glare. It's distracting. Okay. Today is chapter 12, talking about using language. Today's attendance question would have been, what's your favorite or least favorite smell? I have a candle here that I got from Buff City Soap, and it's called Sunshine, Citrus Spritz, and Italian Coasts. It smells good. As for my least favorite smell, it would probably be garbage, because it's a medley of different smells. Um, so yeah, that would probably be it for me. But anyway, um, don't know how you would share your favorite, least favorite smell. You can tell me on Tuesday if you want, if you watch this lecture. But yeah, there we go. Moving on to the agenda for today. So we can't do attendance, obviously. Um, Denotative versus connotative. You may have remembered this from the textbook reading, but it's just sort of the dictionary definition versus the feelings that we attribute to those words. And I'll give you some examples in a little bit. And that's what that is, that activity. We're just sort of comparing the differences in words. And I don't want you to think of these words as opposites, but we'll get there. I'm getting ahead of myself. We're also going to talk about abstract versus concrete, how they differ. Using vivid language in terms of using similes and metaphors, using rhythm, parallelism, repetition, alliteration, antithesis. So, and there's a little bit of examples for that as well. We're going to have appropriate language guidelines next. There are 4 different ways to sort of use language appropriately, and then inclusive language guidelines as well, with some good and bad examples for both. So without further ado, let's get started. And then we'll talk about next class, which would be on Thursday. And I believe it's chapter 13, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm probably just going to sit here and record that lecture too, so I don't have to get all dressed up on Thursday. But anyway. Okay. Like I said, denotative is the literal dictionary meaning behind a word or a phrase. So when I say that, it's just sort of, look it up and what does it literally mean? And that contrasts with the connotative, which is what do we associate with that word? What emotions are triggered by that word? So let's look at a couple examples so you can see what I'm talking about. The word smell versus the word aroma. All right. And you might be thinking those are pretty much the same thing, but aroma is just sort of, it brings out more feelings than just smell, because that's just, very simple. If something smells, it could be good or bad, but it is pretty neutral on its own. Aroma doesn't really give a bad negative meaning. Nobody thinks of aroma as being bad. But if you think of a word like rancid, that elicits a sort of like disgust, that type of emotion. House versus home. A house is the physical building, right? But a home is something that's closer to, the feelings, the heart, When you think of your home, what do you think of? You might think of security, safety, or just comfort, not like the word house. Extracted versus yanked, right? So you think extracted, that's pretty basic. I extract a plant out of the ground. I extract minerals from the earth. But when you hear the word yank, it's got a lot more of a violent connotation to it, almost as if angry. Another example is yell versus scream. And these are kind of similar, but yell is just sort of like I raised my voice. It could be interpreted to be a negative thing, but scream, we think of that as being you're scared, right? That SCR or that SC, the scared scream, that's the connotative version of not just speaking loudly. If somebody yells, they're just yelling. They're not, or whisper, it's just sort of, it's a quiet way of talking. There's not really any emotion attached to that. But here's what I want you to think about. Snake versus snake. All right, so if you think about the literal version of the word snake, it's the animal, right? The dictionary version. But if we think of snake in a connotative way, we sort of think of somebody who's shifty, somebody who is sly, sort of can't be trusted. So that might be a way to help you sort of think about it in terms of what's the dictionary definition of a snake versus what are the feelings elicited from a snake, as if you called somebody a snake, what does that mean? Some more examples. Economical versus cheap, right? Economical is just, the definition of someone who's thrifty, but cheap there is a meaning attached to that. You know, we don't just think of it in terms of the dictionary term. Confident versus arrogant. Somebody could be confident, but that starts to go venture into different territory when you say that they're arrogant. They're a know-it-all, you know. Inquisitive versus nosy. There's a difference between being curious and then prying into other people's business, right? So we can sort of think of what's the emotions attached to the word nosy. Vintage versus old. Now, this is kind of flip-flopped because you might think of old as being a denotative version of this word, just it's old, you know? But vintage has more of a feeling to it. Vintage clothing, vintage rides, vintage wines. There's many different ways to sort of think about this that takes it a step further than it's old. And then finally, we have adventurous versus reckless, right? If somebody's adventurous, this differs from being reckless. So hopefully those examples can sort of help you think about the difference between the two. But again, they're not opposites, right? They can mean the same thing. It's just one doesn't elicit feelings, denotative, and the other does, connotative. So let's move on to using language guidelines. We're trying to do 4 things when we use language. Number 1 is we're trying to use language accurately. We want to make sure that the words that we're speaking are conveyed in the manner that they're supposed to be received in, right? We want to be accurate when we talk. We don't want to be vague. We don't want to leave anything open for interpretation, right? And then the next thing is we want to speak clearly. We want to make sure that we're heard well, and that we're loud enough, we're using emphasis where appropriate, and that we're not muddling our speech. We're not putting a lot of vocal fillers in there like ums and ahs and things like that. Very clear speaking. And then vivid speaking. This takes it a step further than just, you know, of course we want to be accurate, of course we want to be clear, but how can we really entice people? You know, how can we bring them in to listen to us when we talk instead of just, you know, talking very plainly, very matter-of-factly. If you've ever heard of Ben Stein, he's the guy in Ferris Bueller's Day Off who goes, Bueller, anybody? Bueller. Not a very vivid speaker, all right? But like this candle, it tries to use vivid imagery to say citrus spritz, Italian coasts. It's not just oranges, you know, which is what it smells like. But they try to use vivid language to really pull you in. And then finally, we want to be appropriate. This is probably the most important thing when it comes to using language, because if we're not being appropriate, people tune out. They don't want to listen to us anymore, right? So appropriate speaking is really knowing certain other factors, which I will talk about later. But very important that you're appropriate when speaking. In business communication, we want to make sure there's something we talked about called communication competence, and that's saying what is appropriate and what is necessary, right? Because we can definitely say something appropriate, but it's not really necessary. You know, you didn't really need to say that. And it can the opposite can also be true, where we can say something that's necessary, but it's not appropriate, right? We might be thinking, hey, you need to dump your partner. And that might be something that could be necessary for them to hear, but that's not a very appropriate way to say that, right? So those are some guidelines on using language accurately, clearly, vividly, appropriately. Imagery, creating mental images of objects, actions, or ideas, you know, instead of just saying this person is wakeboarding, you know, or we can take it a step further by saying, you know, he rode the waves with intensity. You know, you try to use words that really conjure up some type of picture for the audience that isn't just he rode a surfboard. That's very plain, very simple way of saying it. Abstract words. Now, here we're going to get into the difference between abstract and concrete here. An abstract word can refer to general concepts. Think of the word public speaking. You know, is it happening in a one-on-one, otherwise known as a dyad, D-Y-A-D? Is it referring to group speaking? Is it referring to mass communication, where if you think of a Twitch streamer, they might be talking in front of hundreds or if not thousands of people. So when you use public speaking, it's just a very abstract concept. Next, we can have abstract words that refer to qualities. He's funny. He's smart. He's attractive. These are things that really can't be measured objectively. You know, they're just sort of qualities relating to a person. And then finally, you have attributes. You know, he's tall. You know, it doesn't really get into the specifics of how concretely, how tall is he, you know, in terms of centimeters, in terms of inches or feet. And that's the difference between concrete speaking and abstract speaking. Concrete is really getting specific, really narrowing down, and it's no longer just this thing, this ambiguous type of thing we're talking about. So it refers to tangible objects, but it can just be talking about things more specifically. All right, let me give you an example. We have physical activity. very abstract concept. It can be running, it can be playing sports, it can be dancing. What is physical activity? Walking, jogging. Then we get a little bit more specific, and then, okay, so it's not just recreational hobbies, it's sports. We're getting more concrete. Basketball, but like there's a lot of different sports. There's football, there's soccer, there's tennis, there's pickleball. So then how do we narrow it down a little further? We say basketball. But again, there's a lot of different things in basketball. So we could be saying professional basketball, using a more concrete example that's not as abstract. And then finally, Stephen Curry, Stephen Curry, Stephen Curry. Where it's referring to a specific person, no longer in the realm of being very abstract. So hopefully those examples can kind of help you conceptualize the difference there. Okay, now we're getting into how we use language to be more vivid. So first, I'm sure you've all heard this before. I won't spend too much time talking about it. A simile. Comparison using like or as. Here's an example. With eyes glued on their phones, pedestrians walk the streets like zombies after the apocalypse. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask the question, how could this be turned into a simile using as? So you could say, as if they were zombies walking the streets. Their eyes were glued on their phones. Just instead of using like, we're using as. Now, a metaphor, again, you've already probably heard this before, it's a comparison that doesn't use like or as. America's cities are the windows through which the world looks at American society. It's no longer America's cities are like windows, they just are. Now, rhythm, patterns of sound created by choice, arrangement of words. Here's an example. Or sorry, there's not an example here. You want to make sure that there's just a certain cadence to when you speak. It's not like you're speaking quickly all of a sudden and then you're talking really slowly. You just sort of have an even pacing to when you talk. Parallelism, similar arrangement of pair or series of related words, phrases, or sentences. Here's an example. Rich and poor, intelligent and ignorant, wise and foolish, virtuous and vicious, man and woman, it is ever the same. Each soul must depend wholly on itself. So you can see rich and poor, those type of giving these examples of parallels. All right, repetition, reiterating the same word or series of words. It can be at the beginning or end of successive sentences or clauses. Here's an example. If you want wellness with wealth, come to India. If you want health and wholeness of life, come to India. And if you want prosperity and peace, come to India. Okay? So you're just saying the same thing at the end of the sentence. All right, alliteration. Repeating initial consonants in closer adjoining words. The word consonant here just means something that isn't a vowel. Here's an example. Nothing great is accomplished without cooperation, compromise, and common cause. All right, all using the letter C, that consonant C in the beginning of those words. And then we have antithesis, juxtaposition. This just means that we have two things that are sort of at odds with each other. They're two things, like think of the word jumbo shrimp. That's the way I can sort of conceptualize it for myself. It's a juxtaposition of ideas, usually in parallel structure, kind of like parallelism, but it's slightly different. Here's an example. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So another example that I think of is the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That might not be a perfect example, but it's just to give you another example. So when we use language, we're trying to be appropriate, and there are 4 different ways that we can speak appropriately. Number 1 is the occasion. If you're at a funeral, you don't want to be cracking jokes, unless you're giving a eulogy about somebody and you're making it lighthearted, So when it comes to occasion, you want to make sure that it's the right time and place. A stand-up set on a stage is different than if you were in a play, in a theater. Those are 2 different occasions where one type of speaking would be more appropriate than the other. Next, we have audience. When I deliver packages to a retirement home, I wouldn't speak to the people there like I would if I was just a random apartment building. There's this thing in communication called elder speak, which is when you sort of talk in a more childlike, louder way. Are you ready to take your medicine today? That's elder speak, So you want to try to avoid that and sort of talk to them like they're human beings, not like they're children. So whether it's people who are older, whether it's students like yourselves, or whether it's a group of peers, you want to make sure that you're using language appropriate for the audience. And then topic. I'll just stick with the theme of a nursing home. You wouldn't want to go in there and just start talking about death, because it's not really an appropriate topic for where you're speaking. This would be different if you were talking to people who maybe were middle-aged, like, oh, we're all trying to plan for retirement. But if you're talking to people who are already retired, that topic doesn't really have the same amount of oomph, or if I was talking to you all, young adults about retirement, it's like, well, I'm not really thinking about that right now. So it's not necessarily an appropriate topic, but it's not, the end of the world. And then finally, we have the speaker. So while we might be thinking about the occasion, the audience, and the topic, we also have to think about you as a speaker, and how you can use language appropriately. So you don't want to go up there and just start rambling, which is kind of ironic because that's what I'm sort of doing right now. But the speaker needs to be appropriate because, like I said in the very beginning, people will tune out if you start speaking inappropriately. They don't want to listen to you anymore, and the whole crowd will start to turn on you. So occasion, audience, topic, speaker. I'm just realizing that this is sort of an acronym, OATS. OATS are important. All right, inclusive language. It doesn't stereotype or demean on the basis of multiple factors: gender, race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, all those things. We even talked about this in the syllabus on day one. This is not the classroom is not an environment where any of these things are appropriate. We don't demean, we don't stereotype. Even when I did my first stand-up set, they said no hate speech, and that's a given. We don't want to be demeaning other people. So let me give you some more guidelines on inclusive language. Avoid generic he's. We can't just assume that it's just guys, because the world is a mixed place. Even the binary of man and woman is sort of being, is sort of put at odds on people who identify as gender fluid. It might they want a pronoun that's they or them. So try to avoid using he when talking about anything in particular. Avoid man when referring to both men and women. Avoid stereotyping by jobs and social roles by gender. And I'll have examples for all these so you can sort of see. And then use the names that groups use to identify themselves, right? You don't want to be, calloused in the way that you refer to a certain group of people. And again, there's some examples. Let's start with the generic he. Each time a surgeon walks into the operating room, he risks being sued for malpractice. Even the word surgeon, we can sort of, in our mind, sort of assume that that's always a guy, but that's not true. Anybody can be a surgeon, anybody can be a doctor, So I like to think of the word secretary, because in our heads, or at least in my head, we sort of always think of the secretary or the receptionist as being a woman, but that is simply not true. So we can't just assume that this goes in either case, that it's not just she is a secretary. So how do we change this to be more appropriate and effective? We just simply sub out that he for he or she or they. If you just wanted to say each time a surgeon walks into the room, they risk being sued for malpractice. You wouldn't say risks because they risks doesn't sound very good. So hopefully that helps you understand why you should avoid that type of language. And then finally, or not finally, second, the generic man. If a large comet struck the Earth, it could destroy all of mankind. We would sub that out for saying, if a large comet struck the Earth, it could destroy all of human life or just humanity. That's speaking for everybody, not just men, not just women, but everyone. Excuse me. Avoid stereotyping. So being a small businessman in the current economic climate is not easy. You would sub that man out for business person, or just, you could even use a term that's even more gender neutral and specific, because I'll allude back to the concrete versus abstract. Business person is a very abstract concept, so we want to say like being a business owner, being an executive, being a broker, those are things that sort of narrow it down into more concrete versions. Okay, finally, how would other people, identify themselves? Those are the terms we should use. The Paralympics show what handicapped people can accomplish in the athletic arena versus the Paralympics show what people with disabilities can accomplish in the athletic arena, right? Handicapped, it's not a very good term to use. Back in the day, people used to use the word crippled, and we obviously don't want to use that because it implies some type of deficit. It implies that they're not capable of doing things that people would normally do. And you might be thinking the same thing about people with disabilities, but it softens the blow. It's no longer like you're stereotyping and you're not conjuring up an image of what somebody is in terms of their capability. So that is it for this lecture. Thursday, what would be Thursday, we're talking about delivery, but I'm probably just going to end this recording and then just start on that one. I would recommend that you read chapter 13, complete the homework, et cetera, et cetera. But that was chapter 12. I want to thank you all for bearing with me. Again, like I said, I know this isn't the way we would normally do things, but I want to make sure that y'all have your spring break when the high school has its spring break and that I'm not overlapping with that in any way. So thank you all for watching this lecture, and I will see you in the next chapter. Take care.